Good evening, and thank you for tuning in once again. My name is Bill Morse, and the name of this program, as you saw on the title screen, is What Do You Think? Now, this is the first show in probably 2 months, and there's a very good reason why I haven't felt compelled to come in and do another program or come up with other topics. Part of it is much of what we see or hear in the news now, it comes from different angles. It depends on your news source, of course, but generally, and I don't think it really matters too much from which political direction you're coming from, but there's a lot of use of computer-generated imagery in video footage, and also the use of artificial intelligence in actually creating from scratch, not just altering video or audio, but actually creating something new that sounds authentic. And I find that very troubling because I think socially, as a society, we are not ready to engage in this type of technology, and it would be very easy should 6 or 7 companies that control the major news outlets be on the same page and have the same agenda and tilt the news to their advantage or to the advantage of people who have invested in this or that, either in this country or overseas. I think the use of CGI or computer-generated imagery or artificial intelligence has been used successfully in the Ukraine, where news outlets have been using video game footage or actually recreating fight scenes that did not take place, or fight scenes in which Ukrainian forces were the aggressors or the ones bombing homes and not the Russian army. Not to say that the Russian army is not responsible for war crimes, but we are given a very tilted view. And this is through technology. 20, 30 years ago, it would not have been possible. The best we could have done 20, 30 years ago, perhaps, was doctoring photographs, and that has happened in the news as well. So it's been a problem for a while, and I think it's ramped up now with the technology that makes pure fabrication possible, not just through audio but visual. And as they say, pictures can move people to peace. Pictures can move people to war. And I'm afraid that what we've been shown coming out of the Ukraine is moving us towards a much more aggressive posture. And I worry that just as we went into Iraq looking for non-existent weapons of mass destruction, we may be going into the Ukraine through shipment of arms looking for a boogeyman, and find out that the boogeyman is actually the government that's under siege. So a lot of questions, and I bring this up because I wanted to start looking at a book that was published in 1949. The writer's name was George Orwell, and the book is called 1984. And maybe some of you have read this book, this novel. It's a work of fiction set in the future, 1984, which was futuristic for 1949 when Orwell wrote this story. And I think it's timely to look at this again and make comparisons between our current situation, whereby our opinions are being formed for us in many cases. Our behavior is being modified very often on subliminal level without our permission. And it's George Orwell speaks also of a very intrusive Big Brother type of civilization or community order. We have another word for it now, another term, and it's called One World Order. Big Brother was in 1984. One World Order, expression that came out in full force through the World Economic Forum movement started by financier Charles Schwab. And we've had many world leaders go through the World Economic Forum schooling system, whereby we're looking at consolidating power and having one group represent the entire planet in the interest of peace. And there's peace in this book as well, 1984, but it comes at a bit of a price, and we're going to gradually learn how steep and how varied that price is in regards to the loss of our own personal freedoms, which we have experienced over the last 2 years. So, we're just going to read one chapter, and this stuff is pretty good, tonic water. It's very good if you've got cramps, and it's actually, the quinine is healthy for you. So, it was a bright, cold day in April. Oh, like today. Today was cool. And the clocks were striking 13, military time, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a whirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, so that's about 39 inches. The face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift or the elevator. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working. And at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about whenever you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, a telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face neutrally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustached face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediate opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word Ingsoc. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle. I'm not sure what a blue bottle is, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however. Only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the over-fulfillment of the 9th three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Sounds like Alexa. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. Reminds me of a film with Gene Hackman and I believe it was Will Smith, Enemy of the State, in which they talk about the huge underground complex of the National Security Agency, NSA, under Fort Meade in Maryland, not far from Washington, D.C., where there were, and this was in 1990, 8 square miles of computer mainframe underground. And the idea was to track phone calls, and anytime, according to the film, this was in the script, but I believe it's fairly accurate. Anytime anyone said the word B-O-M-B, today that word would be V-I-R-U-S, there would be a check mark, and somebody or the conversation would go through another computer and be further filtered until it reached human ears, and it was decided whether or not to further investigate. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to did live from habit that became instinct in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he well knew, even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought with a sort of vague distaste, this was London. Chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with balks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bombed sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herbs straggled over the heaps of rubble, and the places where the bombs had cleared a large path and there had sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lit tableaus occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, Mini-True in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up, terrace after terrace, 300 meters in the air, about 1,000 feet. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on the white face in elegant lettering, the 3 slogans of the party. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. The Ministry of Truth contained, it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victory Mansions, you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the 4 ministries between which the entire apparatus of the government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names in Newspeak: Mini-True, Mini-Pax, Mini-Love, and Mini-Plenty. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter, except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun traps. Even the streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with jointed truncheons, billy clubs. Winston turned around abruptly. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid with a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell, as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for the shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly, his face turned scarlet, and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes, and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room, sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick, quarter-sized blank book with a red back and a marbled cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, in the end wall where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall opposite the window. To one side of it there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing he was now about to do. So we're going to take a watering break. And I think we'll cut it off right there for now. Think about what he is about to do. If you've read the story, you already know, or perhaps you remember what he's about to do. But we'll leave off there, and next Thursday I won't be in town. What I'll try to do is pre-record, and the program can still be aired on Thursday of next week at 5:45. So we'll leave off there, and I hope you find the story interesting. One thing I wanted to add before we shut off. This, as I said, this novel was published in 1949. I believe George Orwell spent a few years writing the story. And remember that in the late 40s, at least in this country, televisions were still relatively new. A new gimmick, or a new device, I should say, a new trend that was developing. Most people had a radio, and there were radio programs like soap operas, game shows, and many of them were starting to transfer from radio to the visual aspects that television offered. If people wanted to watch television, most people went to a bar, or sometimes they stood outside of a department store window on the sidewalk and perhaps watched something from a television screen, television that was part of the shop window display. And manufacturers, and there were perhaps 40 TV manufacturers in the late 40s, all American, made in the USA. Zenith, for example, in Chicago, RCA in Camden, New Jersey, Philco across the river in Philadelphia. And they all entered the television field. And sporting events, of course, were a big deal. People were actually able to watch remotely a football game, a baseball game. And fights were also very popular. And I remember my parents telling me that before I was born, they would go to my uncle's, and my uncle was the only one in the family that had a television. It was a 10-inch picture tube, round, and it was black and white. And somebody was the de facto technician who knew how to manage all the controls, vertical, horizontal, the brightness, synchronizing the roll, or trying to avoid the vertical roll by stabilizing the picture. And of course, you had to set the tone for the volume. So I think this is the idea of the telescreen, that not only do we watch it, but it watches us. Just like Alexa, as the person I alluded to before, not really a person, but we talk to Alexa, and Alexa listens to us. So the foundation is there. I don't know if this will be prophetic. We'll continue reading the story, and then you can draw for yourself the parallels between what George Orwell saw for the world in 1949 and what is actually happening now, not only in our country, but in around the world, with the advent of technology and the ability to manipulate the news and artificially form public opinion. So please tune in again next week, next Thursday at 5:45. Wish you a good weekend, and God bless. Cheers.